Well, spring has sprung. Finally, the natural world is waking up all around us.
That it is.
And all this green growth is a good thing, right?
Not really, Mr. Altizer.
Not necessarily.
Not at all.
Not all green is good. And in this video, we're going to go over non-native invasive species control and why it's important.
Mossy Oak Properties. We're outdoorsmen. Find their favorite place.
When it comes to wildlife management and land ownership, one task that I think gets pushed down to the bottom of the to-do list or often gets overlooked for whatever reason, justified or not, is non-native invasive species control.
But it's so expensive. It's so much time consuming, and there's so much of it.
It is all those things. It's a lot of work. It's a war that you won't win. But when you're managing your property, whether that's for wildlife overall, better hunting opportunities, if you're managing it species specific for pollinators or birds or ruffed grouse, white-tailed deer, whatever your goals are, removing non-native invasive species are only going to help you accomplish your goals more efficiently and more quickly.
Yeah, and depending on where you live in this country, you're going to have species of more dominance.
Right.
Like here in the Midwest, we have multiflora, autumn olive, bush honeysuckle, the tree of heaven or Atlantis.
Right.
Those are your common ones. Now in your neck of the woods you have...
We have a lot of those, but I've got more Japanese barberry. I don't have a lot of bush honeysuckle. So it varies, and Eric and I, we're not that far apart, but the non-native invasives that we have on our properties are very different. So before you get started, reach out to a local biologist who can walk your property with you, because if you're unsure of what non-native invasives you have on your property, identifying them is step number one, because in your process of removing them, you don't want to remove valuable native vegetation and species in the process.
Taking down oak. Yeah, it's just, you hit the hammer on the nail there. Contact if you don't know, because sometimes depending on the time of the year, they look a little similar, and that's on purpose.
Yeah.
You know, they want to survive, and yeah, contact someone that like you just mentioned, and also the herbicide.
Right.
You know, the herbicide is important because of the cost, because of time.
Yeah.
It's time of year to put this stuff on.
Exactly.
You know, so.
This first video in this series of invasive species control, we just want to establish why it's important to tackle non-native invasives on your property, because as you mentioned, it's a lot of work. It can be overwhelming, but it's work that I think is absolutely necessary and worth doing. Our native wildlife have evolved and thrive on native plants and native vegetation.
Yes.
Non-native invasive plants, they are exactly that. They are invasive, they are aggressive, and they displace our native vegetation that all wildlife, from pollinators, bees, butterflies, bugs, all the way up to our game species, white-tailed deer, have evolved and thrive on.
Yeah, and you'll hear in the outdoor industry world, the deer hunting world, the turkey world and stuff, that there's not, you know, hey, it's a necessary evil. I've said it, okay, I'll openly admit it. But here's the thing, like you mentioned, we're thinking small scale, the animals that we think of, the turkey, the deer.
Right.
But man, the world is so much bigger and so much dependent on the native stuff. Yeah. And by controlling those invasives, which is really easy. It's not that hard to do.
It's hard work, but it's a simple process. I mean, it requires a little bit of sweat equity, but like Eric said, we think of our game species, but our native insects, they will not or cannot consume plants that are alien plants, invasive species. We see autumn olive behind us or multifloral rose, and we can justify it being on the place where I saw a deer browse it or it's some cover. Sure, but we can do better than that. Think of our insects and those plants behind us, autumn olive, barberry, multifloral rose, whatever the case may be, those are worthless to many of our native wildlife species.
Yeah, and they're keeping from like yellow poplar, cherries, to saplings. They're restricting those plants that are beneficial to the butterfly caterpillars, right?
Absolutely. Eastern tiger swallowtail, I'm sure it's a butterfly you've all seen. If not, Google it and you'll recognize it. It's a big yellow butterfly with black stripes on its back. The larvae from that species can only eat the plants from tulip poplar, yellow poplar, black cherry, and birch trees. You take those off the landscape, if they are displaced by non-native invasive species, the larvae from those caterpillars cease to exist. Larvae is step one in the caterpillar process. Then it becomes a caterpillar, can't have butterflies if you don't have caterpillars. So think the entire scale, as you mentioned. We think of just our game species, but the world, as you mentioned, is so much bigger than that.
Yep, absolutely.
And beyond that, I think removing non-native invasive species, it's more about the principle than anything else. Because you know, we can go out with a backpack sprayer and spray multiple rows till we're blue in the face. And is it going to make a difference? Absolutely, on a small scale. Sometimes those differences, they take years to see as those native plants respond and you free up space and resources, but it's the principle more than anything else. We, as land ownership and land stewards, it's our responsibility to leave the land and wildlife better than we found it. And when we have properties that are overrun with non-native invasive species, as we mentioned, it's not a war you'll win. You'll never eradicate all of them. They're in the seed bank, birds are going to bring them in, whatever the case may be, but it's just a principle and a decision to leave the land better than we found it is, I think, step number one, or a reason why to tackle this big job. And more than anything in this video, we just wanted to establish why it's important to remove non-native invasive species off your property. As you begin your land ownership journey, whether you just acquired a piece of property or you're making the decision to take ownership over your piece of property and leave it better than you found it, removing non-native invasive species should be part of your to-do list, because it is exactly that. You're leaving the land and the wildlife better than you found it.
Mossy Oak Properties, where outdoorsmen find their favorite place.